Herman Hopp's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, natural order and monarchy being superior to democracy. And I think it was Churchill that quipped something along the lines of, it's democracy is what the best system we have or something. And Hopp obviously disagrees with that.
I think that any system, it has the capability of being an abject failure. At the bottom of everything is engagement, and every system has its pros and its cons. But if there's some fundamental principles that aren't understood by the general population, then the general population can always be exploited. I think it's fair to say that certain governmental systems or certain societal systems are more prone to that than others, perhaps, or at least safeguards aren't in place. But plenty of times in the past, there's plenty of historical context for systems that have had protections in place, and those have systematically been sort of chipped away at until they don't exist anymore or they're ignored. And so, I think that the fundamental issue here is education and an understanding of what natural law is, what natural principles are, and that's something that isn't taught. And because of that, of course, we leave ourselves open to all kinds of exploitation.
If I can just go back one to the idea of democracy as it's presented now, I don't think anybody sincerely suggests that the form of democracy that is espoused in the modern Western world has anything to say about democracy to suggest that it's a good system, unless they're actively trying to use that system to control the people within it and to make money out of it. I mean, that is effectively what it is. I don't think any serious political philosopher over the ages has ever put forward democracy as we now regard it as being a sensible system by which people should live their lives. And when one looks at the way it's rolled out, well, the way it's practiced in societies like the United Kingdom or the United States, and then the suggestion that that model should be sort of gifted to countries that are in, say, South Asia or the Middle East is totally absurd, I would say, because in supposedly enfranchising people, in actual fact, all you're doing is imposing a system of daylight robbery. We were talking about the National Health Service on the most recent News Extra program that Mike and I were on together, and people obviously have different views about it, and I don't want to get dragged down that rabbit hole, but the fact of it is that the National Health Service costs over £200 billion every year now, and for what? But that would not be possible without the system of supposed democracy that we have now, which is in effect saying, well, you get to vote, and because of that, we're going to take all your money. So that's a pretty bad place to start. Going towards the idea of monarchy, again, I would suggest that it's a false binary, and I have to be careful what I say here because of the way in which we're covering the devolution agenda. But to my mind, the idea of a population as large as that of the United Kingdom, which is approaching, as far as we're aware, about 70 million people, the idea that that number of people should be under, well, control is not the right word perhaps, but under the government or governance of one individual is, again, ridiculous. So the suggestion that it's either a sort of representative democracy, which of course it isn't, or that one person can in any way have some sort of oversight or consideration for or regard for that number of people, again, is ridiculous unless there is actually a system that operates consistent with that. So that at every lower level, there is a coherent system by which people receive the benefit of the monarch's benevolence or wisdom or whatever it should be. But of course, we don't have that. We have a monarch, and then nothing in effect. I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying and not actually factually representing the situation, but it doesn't correspond. So I think both systems have enormous problems, and loath as I am to bring him into the conversation this early, Yuval Noah Harari, Klaus Schwab's sort of jack-in-a-box academic bloke, he's written extensively and I would say quite coherently about some things, definitely not very coherently about others, but one of the things he talks about is societal groupings and the idea that 150 people represents the approximate maximum for having a structure within which relationships between people can work effectively without there being all the ills that are associated with democracy. So those are some of my thoughts on the answers that are presented, but I don't think any of them are actually answers.
I think I'll just add a little bit to that if I could. So the United Kingdom, let's say Britain, is, and in fact others would even argue that it's not even Britain, that it's England, was never a democracy. It was a constitutional monarchy, and the role of the monarch is one of these instances where the role of the monarchy has been changed over the years and subverted, in fact, by the occupants of the role in many cases as well. I mean, if we look back through post Battle of Hastings history of England, actually there aren't too many kings or queens of England that we can say did a good job. Henry VII is one that I think did a good job. Queen Anne, while she lived, did mostly a good job. But the role of the monarch was to, and once we became a constitutional monarchy, was to do that, to uphold the constitution and act as a limit on the excesses of Parliament, and that's something that has been long since forgotten by the current incumbents of the position. So I've from a constitutional point of view, I've been quite in favour of monarchy in the UK, not at all in favour of the royal family, because they are not doing the job, and in fact they're so caught up in their own personal political machinations, particularly around environment and climate change and these kinds of things, that they long since forgotten what the role is supposed to be. So, and it's the same in the United States. Okay, their constitution was created, as you say, and didn't sort of develop naturally, but it was created out of what they perceived to be the best aspects of constitutions in Britain and France in particular, which you could argue developed naturally over hundreds of years. But all the protections that constitution, that when the founding fathers wrote that constitution, they put protections in to try to limit the ability of future governments and future federal powers to the kinds of excess that they perceived they were likely to enter into, and those limitations have been systematically chipped away at in both countries, in the UK and in the United States, so that they don't basically exist anymore. The constitutions of both countries are ignored, and of course in Britain the constitution is ignored because people say there isn't one, because it's not in one place, and it's complex and it's hard to follow and so on. But of course, something which has developed and evolved over, since basically certainly 1,000 years, is naturally going to be complex and difficult to understand. But that doesn't make it wrong. We got to remember we don't live in a democracy, and the term democracy, as I think we've sort of mentioned, is I think we can say it is 180 degrees from what it should be, really, as Charles has said. So, lots of people are looking at monarchy as being something dangerous because it's power in the hands of one person, but not necessarily. It can be the role of the monarch, as it's supposed to be in the UK, is one of being aware of what the limitations are on the executive in the country, and protecting the people from that. And that is that's in the coronation oath, and consistently ignored by monarch after monarch. So upholding the laws and customs of the country is something that is the core role of king or queen. It's been adhered to for a long time.
At the risk of falling into the logical fallacy of the no true Scotsman argument, there hasn't been a real democracy, or there hasn't been a real monarchy, but still striving towards something is better than simply brushing it aside. A monarchy is superior historically to democracy, and I think the sort of idea that monarchies are just sort of this King Joffrey idea from Game of Thrones, where the king just wants to kill everybody. I mean, it's more that's more in the realm of fantasy than reality. Because if you think of natural order emerging, like you'll have a family that settles on a piece of ground, and they decide they're going to farm it a bit, and as it expands slightly, they might need a bit of help, and so they'll get some people from, I don't know, neighboring town or something to come and help them. They might offer them some perks to stay on the property, and then over time it builds and it becomes something, but it still belongs to the family, the farmer himself.
Yeah, but historically, if we look at the history of all this, we've seen a number of styles of monarchy in England, for example. We've seen I mean, this is probably an oversimplification, but nonetheless, it gives an idea. We've seen the sort of really unpleasant dictatorial monarchy that it believes that they own everything, and therefore they are in complete control and can do what they like, and they are the sort of King Joffrey figure from Game of Thrones. We have seen that in the past, but we've also seen weak monarchs that are totally manipulable, and you end up actually with more or less the same type of outcome. Henry VIII would be a great example of that. The people around him played him left, right, and center over the fact that he couldn't have children, and you sort of see an expression of how he was totally subverted in his own mind by this. There's a if you go to the Tower of London, there's a suit of armor from Henry VIII's later life, and it's got this massive bulge in the crotch area because he was clearly trying to imply that he was an extremely virile person, and that he still was able to do it, sort of thing. But that just, to me, when I saw that, it came across to me as someone who was actually quite, from a mental health point of view, not quite all there, that he needed to make that kind of demonstration. And so he was completely manipulated in many ways by many, many people. And on the other hand, as I say, we have had some strong leadership from monarchs, Henry VII being a good example of it. So it's a bit of a lottery with what you end up with. At the same time, so I take all your points. You're absolutely right that type of thinking is something that is a feature of monarchy, but it relies on the person occupying the post being able to think that way, and to having the personal strength to follow through on it, and not fall into the sort of psychopathic mold that we've seen from many monarchs over the centuries.
I think Louis XV was also considered fairly weak.
Maybe. I can't quite recall, actually. But what I would like to say, first of all, I'm feeling a bit left out because I don't even know what Game of Thrones is. But I do have another.
It's a detective story, Charles.
Yeah. Let's not get into that. But I do have a cultural reference which I think the audience will engage with on a far more profound level, let's say. Now, I disagree with you. I don't think that that a monarchy or a monarch does in fact conform to the idea of the natural order. I don't think that a monarch does come naturally, and what I would like to do is go back, because you're specifically talking about property and land ownership and people belonging to a particular bit of ground or the ground belonging to the people. And I think it's a very, very interesting thing. And my belief is, in fact, that this rot, as I would describe it, started with the agricultural revolution, the first of many agricultural revolutions, in that people had, as they still do in quite a lot of parts of the world, moved according to where there was food, exactly like migratory birds or animals do. And there was no problem with that. And quite how it came about, obviously, I can't explain because I wasn't there. But what happened was that people who had existed on harvesting fruits and other things that were available at particular places at particular times, and otherwise off animal products, by and large, okay, I'm way oversimplifying, but taking advantage of what was there, were convinced that their lives could be different if they started to eat slightly different things, mostly grains. And I don't want to get drawn into some of the stuff that we've talked about in previous weeks, but if you look at where the human health, where we have concerns, it's very interesting to look back to the genesis of that, in terms of agriculture being a system by which we control what we eat rather than the other way around. So there's that side of it, but what that means is that immediately you're creating an artificial system. You're trying to make land do something that it wasn't actually planning to do, and that persists today. And I think that's something that needs to be questioned. I appreciate we are where we are, and we do have a certain number of people that need food, and you can't just change overnight. So, but still, I do think to go back to the point at which this changed is incredibly significant, because the moment you do put people in the same place and ask them to try to exist in a particular way, then with that comes a loss of liberty and an ability to control. And it was exactly the same sales pitch then as it is now, which concerns productivity, which is, well, look, if you grow this stuff now, then you can produce a surplus. So we'll produce a surplus, and then we'll produce more children, and then they will help us work, and then they consume the surplus, and you see where this is going, and it continues and it continues. And so, to get to my cultural reference, which I've been absolutely itching to get into one of these banter sessions, I'd like to quote Australia's premier philosopher, Michael J. Crocodile Dundee, because he's asked, when he takes Sue Charlton out into the bush in the first film, she asks him about all the sorts of issues that he's concerned with, and he doesn't really have any axes to grind. And she says, okay, what about land rights? What about the Aboriginals' claim to the land? And he says, no, well, that's not how the Aborigines see it. They believe that they belong to the land. So the analogy he gives is saying, who owns the land would be like two fleas arguing over who owns the dog they live on. And I know that seems glib, but actually that goes right to the heart of it. And this idea that you can demarcate an area and say that it's yours gives somebody else the potential to try to muscle in or to use that as leverage or whatever it is. The point is that it's only from that you can enter into any kind of situation where monarchy can be proposed or suggested or to come about. Whereas if people were still largely migratory, nomadic, for example, you can see that clans and family groupings would develop, but there would be no need for anything more than that, because you don't need the structure, because you haven't constrained yourself by this rigid association with a particular plot of land and a particular way of life that you're trying to force onto the land rather than the other way around. I just think, I don't want to totally divert the conversation, but I just think it's a really important point to make, that we have gone so far down the track that we've sort of forgotten, in a way, when we're talking about the natural order, we have actually forgotten what the natural order really means.
Well, let me let me ask you something about that then, because if we look at Indigenous people in what is now the United States or Canada, and they lived that way as well, but those clans eventually grew big enough that they ended up for centuries at war with each other over what? Was it over natural resources? Was it over the right to be on a particular piece of land at a time and get access to the animals and the fruits and so on, and they could get access to? So at that point, once you're, is that not a natural? Was that not a result of natural progression, and therefore they had, their nations became larger than just family sized, and they ended up with a chief. So there seemed to be a natural development of a head of the equivalent of a monarch of the tribe, and the tribe is much bigger than a single family or a single clan. So does that not sort of suggest that the argument you've made is only correct up to a point?
Yeah, I'm sure it is, and I mean I certainly don't know enough about that period of history to be able to give an objective viewpoint on it, because one wonders what other factors, what other influences there may have been, which may or may not have been accurately recorded in history. And I think with any society that has in fact, any tradition of history, it's always very difficult to determine exactly what has brought about what. So I don't know is the honest answer, but no, I absolutely take the point that yes, you are right. There has of course been conflict, and I'm not suggesting that there wasn't, and I'm not suggesting that hasn't meant that there'd been larger groupings made. But I think still to go back to the point that therefore a country, I mean, even then we're still talking about groups of people that by and large considered that they could go wherever they wanted to go, and if there were competition for the resources that were in that place, then that would result in conflict, and quite possibly, as you say, would result in larger groupings of people. But I don't know. It's a bit of a chicken and egg argument. But I suppose one thing that I've found fascinating, and I know this is different, it's absolutely not to the point, but I think if we look at a lot of the history of what we regard as tribes in Africa, and the way in which they have been either in conflict with one another or controlled or whatnot, that shouldn't be disassociated from the beginnings of the colonial period, where the initial control mechanism was exactly to manipulate and change the clan and family groupings in order to form what subsequently became known as tribes. So I think it's very easy to have a very sort of blurred view of that period of history. But as for North America, I don't know. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And at what point any of this did start to change, I don't know.
And you see, the other thing, Jerm, is don't want to necessarily take this conversation down a blind alley, but if we're talking about natural order and we're talking about what is natural, I do wonder about this whole discussion about human activity and what's natural and what's artificial. When if we say that we are natural in the sense we've evolved over time to what we are, at what point did it become normal to assume that everything that we produce is somehow artificial because it came out of our brains, which are natural? So I don't know whether you want to go in that direction, but I think this would be worth having a quick discussion about. I'd be interested in Charles's view on that.
Let me just quickly apologize. I have some serious rain coming onto my roof, so if it's coming through,
it's you
Charles,
now.
It's my turn this time.
Sure. You may as well just blame me.
I always come back to a farming scenario, an agricultural setting, because that is the heart of civilization. It is farming. And everything that's built on top of that is effectively centered around the agricultural setting. Of course, now, as we head towards sort of like a technocratic future, agriculture is on the outskirts. It's no longer the center.
Yeah, well, yes. I just to sort of split hairs. I mean, is it actually a farm, or is it a source of food? Because it's quite fascinating how, if say one takes the incredible range of documentary series that David Attenborough has produced over the years, and how, as time has progressed, the climate change narrative has been woven more and more into his script, and actually has become the only point of producing any of his stuff, as far as I understand, in the most recent thing. But I do remember watching one of his things quite recently, or it might not have been a documentary, but anyway, he was talking about, it was actually not dissimilar to what Alan Savory talks about in terms of rehabilitating desolate plains or areas of land that have had major vegetation loss, and rehabilitating them via livestock. I mean, not necessarily what we might regard as domesticated livestock, but with animals. And Attenborough makes the same point, except that he is specifically saying, and then that's it, they must never be touched. Whereas, of course, at the point, going back to the sort of early days that we're talking about, where there were animals there which people would have eaten, but in such a fashion that there would have been no harm to that population in terms of its ability to maintain its levels, or indeed increase its levels. And if they increased to a certain point, then presumably some of that herd, or the entire herd, would have moved elsewhere. But of course, with Attenborough now, that's not how you regard it. It's just sort of, it just keeps going, and humans never get the benefit of it. So yes, a source of food, because I think for us to imagine that food can only come from agriculture, as in practices where we are controlling the meat or plant resources, I think is wrong. When you look at, okay, I live in the countryside, but there is so much food that is just there without you having to do anything about it. So why on earth do we ignore all of that? So I don't mean to be too pedantic. I mean, I do mean to be quite pedantic, but not too pedantic, hopefully. Because the reason I mention it is just, again, it's this whole idea of natural, and the difference between, well, if we can do it, is it natural? And so we're introducing the idea of cooperation, really, because, of course, your city-state you've just referred to, and that cannot work unless some people are going to do such and such a thing in order that other people are fed. I mean, otherwise, why on earth would you go and live in a city? I mean, there will be a little bit of food given what I've just said, but there will basically be no food. So that's an element of it, and I think this is what Ben Rubin and Will Keats' recent discussion on this issue on the natural order was fascinating in bringing out this idea that, in effect, you may do absolutely anything until such point as it impacts on somebody else's life. But of course, the twin aspect of that is this idea of cooperation.
But the reason that all that food that you're talking about is left on the trees, as it were, is because it comes back to the original point of engagement by people, because people want to just sit in front of the television and be entertained rather than take an active role in their lives. The reason that systems of government collapse into corruption and despotic treatment of individuals is because individuals make the wrong choices. And if food is being left on bushes and on trees that's growing naturally and is available, it's because we don't want to spend our time doing that. We want to spend our time watching Game of Thrones.
Yeah, well, this is it, and this goes back to whether it be a constitutional monarchy or some variant of democracy or whatever. Effectively, there's always two different things. There's the system as we find it and as we can fault it over the years, or there's the system as you can design it on paper, which as the jokes always go about socialism or communism, it never ever works out like that. But does that mean that we should stop aspiring to be able to do it? And that relates exactly to the production and consumption of food, and indeed this whole idea of whether something is natural because it's possible.
I mean, look, what Hoppe was ultimately arguing is that a democratic system is A, artificially designed and imposed, B, unsustainable because every democratic government becomes susceptible to being infiltrated, being bought, being manipulated, because the president doesn't have a long-term interest. He's only rent-seeking for 4 or 5 years or whatever.
I think these are all fair points, and I think that that it certainly implies that if you accept those points, it implies that for the reasons you've just suggested, monarchy is superior to democracy. And I think one of the limitations of the conversation that we've had so far is that aside from the discussion of indigenous peoples, we have been focusing on Western leadership, and one country that we haven't considered so far, we're talking about big populations, is China. That society has up until the Cultural Revolution existed as an empire with emperors for thousands of years, very successfully, and not just as an empire that within itself, but a trading empire. And although Western financial interests from once the Silk Road got going, once certain financial interests from Italy started trying to take advantage of that trade, nonetheless, they were largely successful in what they were doing. But it was interesting that China clearly, as big as it was historically, decided that it didn't need to be any bigger, so they built a wall with a view of keeping people out. But of course, that also made it difficult for them to expand any further than the wall. So China is an interesting. I think that we should know much more about the history of China and how it's been governed over the years, and having a look at it. And I don't know enough about it, so I'm not going to try to wax lyrical about it. But something we should be looking at and seeing what the good aspects and undoubtedly bad aspects of that were over the centuries.
I think that's a very good point. I was thinking about China also, and I think Japan. In fact, you're right. Some of the non-Western countries have very different historical structures of hierarchy, which is what you were alluding to earlier, Charles, about culture playing a massive role. The whole world can't be run in the same way. That's absolutely obvious. I mentioned earlier Louis XV. I think it was Louis XVI who ended up triggering the French Revolution. And look at France now.
But the French Revolution, it was really two revolutions. They had a revolution. It began as a revolution that was, in intent much more like what the American Revolution became, and then of course the Jacobin Terror took over the show, and we ended up with, France ended up chopping the heads. So you sort of hinted at this a few minutes ago. They chop the heads off anybody that had an intellect or a brain, and so you ended up absolutely with people that didn't really know anything about anything setting the rules, and so France, modern France and modern French bureaucracy is the result of that, and anybody that's spent any kind of time there knows how absolutely appalling that can be. And of course, France exported that to other countries, North Africa and Lebanon and so on, and Syria, and they exported that way of doing government, which anybody that's lived there, Vanessa will tell you what those countries can be like in terms of just trying to get things done. How the French Revolution ended up and what came afterwards is a good example of when you when sort of the populist mob ends up taking control. It doesn't necessarily work.
But there is a pattern. You mentioned China a moment ago, and the States is similar. as soon as you have a population that is very big, it goes beyond a certain size, what happens naturally? They start federalizing.
I think the direction of travel is important here. I think if as populations grow and they self-organize bottom up, then you choose if you're if you're sensible and clever about this as a group of people, you will choose the best people to be taking on the sort of leadership role. The difficulty comes, as we're seeing in the UK, with this so-called devolution process, when the efforts to create these structures come top down, and that is when you start to see the autocracy coming along and saying, right, don't worry, this is all about bringing democracy to the local level and making sure that you get to no, that's not how it works. This is about bringing centralized control to the local level and making sure that locally the central controller has the right puppet in place. I don't know enough about the development of China to know if that's how those structures actually were created and what the effect on the ground is historically. That's something that I would like to know a lot more about. But I think that's an important distinction when we're talking about how federalized structures are created.
Timing also is another factor. I mean, I can't remember if it was meant to be ascribed to one particular Chinese diplomat or whether it's just sort of the Chinese view. But the story goes, within the last couple of decades, a Chinese diplomat was asked at a state event, a state banquet, I think, in the UK. He was asked his opinion of the results of the French Revolution, and his reply was that it was too early to tell. And it's sort of often reported as though it's a funny one. It's not funny. I mean, I think it's completely serious. And all these societies that we talk about, whether they be defined by the idea of an ethnicity or nationhood or a state, they're all at different points in the various cycles they go through. And I think that's a really important point to make, because yes, I would agree with you that you can absolutely point to examples to reinforce your point about a federalist approach to this, that, and the other. I would say that what we're seeing in the United Kingdom at the moment is being sold as that, but completely missold. It's absolutely the opposite. And the point about society, let's say in the UK, is that we are at we're at a certain stage of this iteration of our civilization, if you will, that means that we are prone to or unable to do, or the conditions are set for something that they may not be ripe for in even France or China or the United States. And I think there are some very interesting. I mean, this is something I would like to look at more. But to look at the indicators, what are the associated factors with the sorts of things that we're talking about? And one of the things that springs to mind, which again I would like to investigate much more fully, is talking about culture, but particularly the way it expresses itself in art form. And this is something that Camille Paglia, the academic who's been controversial over the years, but this is something that she talks about a lot, how the art of a civilization indicates at what point that is. And there's every suggestion that our, certainly British, Western, whatever, civilization is absolutely reaching an end point. I'm not saying the end, but an end point in this cycle because of the way that this art expresses itself. And she says typically that it brings out themes of, say, androgyny, or the idea that the male form is somehow pathetic, as compared with, say, the types of sculpture that Michelangelo was producing, of strapping muscular men and that kind of thing. So it's just those sorts of things are really interesting, not taken in isolation, but looked at alongside all the sorts of things that are happening politically in civilizations. And we talked about this the other week, actually. I was talking about Brits getting tattoos of stuff that they just simply don't understand. Whereas if you think, let's look at the former Soviet Union countries where there is still this ideal of the sort of perfect specimen. I mean, the propaganda posters, which go back many years and are in a way sort of laughable, but actually they do still mean something. And I think we've gone way beyond that now in the UK. So, but I think all these things are really related, and we should bear the whole situation in mind, not just what we might describe as the sort of political element of it. There are so many other factors at play, because if you don't consider the other factors, then you can't see how the population has been either brainwashed to ignore or go along with something, or indeed motivated to change it.
Gavin McInnes has often said that everything is downstream from culture. And I think that kind of echoes your sentiment to some degree, Charles, that politics is not upstream from culture, but in fact it is downstream from culture. And this is why
But Jerm, that's a really interesting point, because the question, because if we're talking about natural order, the question is, does culture develop naturally, or is culture manipulated? And to follow on from Charles's point, when we're looking at the artwork that's being produced at the moment, and in fact you look at academia as a whole, this has such an influence on culture, not only because what follows from what's being taught in academia is scripts for television shows, it's scripts for plays, it's the type of art that we're seeing, and maybe perhaps it's a feature of a collapsing society that culture becomes something which isn't an expression of that society, but is used as a mechanism of control in and of itself, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yes, I mean, sure, I agree, but I also still think that historically, everything was downstream from culture, and that culture did emerge. If you consider the Zulus, for example, right, they emerged out of the various Bantu tribes in southern Africa. And now here's what's interesting. They maintain their culture thanks to their sort of monarchical structure.
So my question is whether that is because of democracy, or whether it actually even matters what your system of governance is, because so this is a question I suppose we're asking in this whole discussion: is democracy in and of itself such a weak system that it naturally collapses under its own weight, or is it that no matter what your political system, at some point, as people stop paying attention, or they relax their guard or whatever, the parasitic class moves in and perverts it to its own ends. And I think the problem here is that and we can discuss whether this is part of the natural order or not, whether there is naturally a minority within the human race which is parasitic by nature and psychopathic by nature, and that they will always move in and take control. And once that happens, then whatever your system of governance, you see the devolution of our culture, of our societies, and the tendency towards conflict and disgraceful treatment of individuals.
Sure, and I think you're correct. But I mean, if you think about our understanding of modern democracy, I don't think any democracy has somehow led to more prosperity and freedom over the last 250 years or so. Consider the civilizations that have had the largest historical impact. You mentioned China, for sure. I mean, they were around for thousands of years, and as you said, successful. And I think the Roman Empire too, and that also wasn't really democratic. But I mean, okay, that's a whole different discussion. But part of its collapse is linked to its desire to constantly expand.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. When considering the natural order and the constant requirement to search for equilibrium, like any system. And I think the point about the prevalence of, say, psychopathy is fascinating, because I think this is where a lot of people will come unstuck, perhaps, in that we, in this discussion here, the three of us would have, as articulated by these conversations, broadly overlapping worldviews, and yet they are very much discordant with the majority of people who are out there, because they have been conditioned, I would say, to think a particular thing. I don't think there's anything natural about that. I think these are thoughts that are introduced via all the mechanisms that we talk about, whether it be subverted democracy or culture that's been, again, subverted. But there is a well-recognized, well-documented quota, let's say, of people in any society who have a tendency towards psychopathy. There are all sorts of other things, but I believe that largely human nature, if that's what we're going to call it, doesn't really change, and therefore there will be times where the equilibrium is upset, because a certain force will be able to exert itself in an unchecked sense, but not all the time. And I think, therefore, what we go through is a constant process by which those things do eventually self-correct, which goes back to the point I'm making about timing, in that I would imagine that the system surrounding us in the United Kingdom, I don't mean this in an apocalyptic, in that sort of sense, but what I mean is that it will collapse at some point, and that's fine, because something else will replace it, but we don't really know what that is yet. But I think we can be quite clear on why it's happened, because the number of people that want to behave in such a fashion as to create poor conditions for others in society, and they do unfortunately have the control, the will, and the means to do so. We're talking about the sort of the elite oligarchic class. Well, it doesn't really matter who they are, but the point is that the influence they have, I say, is absolutely disproportionate, and they shouldn't wield it, but they've been able to. But that will only go on until a certain point. Quite what will determine that, I don't know. But we're going back to the natural order. For whatever reason, that does seem to be the way in which people express themselves across the entire spectrum of society. So there will be a point where that does sort of self-correct, and I think what we're talking about, whether it be going back thousands of years through Chinese history or anything else, that there will have been points all along the way where that will have happened. The same thing with the fall of Rome and everything else. So ultimately, greed, let's say, psychopathy, whatever, does burn itself out, or does cause that implosion. To what degree an awareness of that can mean that people can actively do something about it, or whether it has to just run its course, I don't really know. But I think it is absolutely observable.
Isn't a great way of looking at it, also, if you just take a step back and scale everything down, right down. How do you govern your home and your family and those who work on your property? I mean, that's the way I like to look at it. And then from there, you scale up.
Yeah, to an extent. Although, I mean, I sort of go back to the let's say, the prehistory of before we're talking about property ownership, land ownership, agriculture, whatever. This idea of conforming to somebody else's plan, will, whatever, I think only comes from a situation in which, if you didn't conduct yourself in a particular manner, you would either starve or die, because there were obvious ways in which you dealt with a particular situation. And I think all you're talking about now is really just an extension of that, where there will be, in most cases, one person that has a vision and an understanding of how to avoid starvation and death at one end of the spectrum, but mostly to engender a system that is for the benefit of everybody. But it does need to conform to the sort of natural requirements, I would say, and the mental side of that, happiness and all the rest of it is clearly an absolutely enormous part of it, and that's sort of the struggle we have. If we imagine a life where every day is in fact a battle for survival, then you're not really at leisure to be considering all the sorts of factors that we do consider now. And therein lies a massive problem, a little bit like the whole idea of knowledge and even the very discussion we're having. I mean, this people who would want to enter into a discussion like this or even listen to it are in a very, very small minority. I wouldn't have it any other way. I would not want at all to be in a position where you just don't even think about these things, because they're just, that's you just go through life and it sort of passes you by and you just get what you get. I think that would be appalling, even if in considering these things you appreciate that the situation is not perhaps exactly as you'd have it. But yes, I think this is sort of what it goes back to. This idea of through cooperation and all the rest of it, we've achieved what is regarded as sort of development. But with that comes this extraordinary sort of slack in the system, and it's kind of what the heck do we do with that? And then that leads into let's have a monarch, or let's have a democracy, or all the other stuff that you wouldn't have had when it was just right. We need to go and get some food today.
Yeah, but I mean, the point that I was making, I mean, I'm agreeing with you, but the point I was making is that nobody sits down and says, right, this is how we're going to run our household. It just naturally occurs.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, sorry, I wasn't trying to disagree. All I was doing was sort of harking back to a time where it's just right. Well, if you don't jump across the ravine now, that bear will eat you. And
yes.
I think that's how I tend to think of it now. Not so much with the ravines or bears, sadly, but yeah.
Also, I just want to point out, because I'm fairly certain that somebody will mention this, but the anarchy or anarchist view of having no sort of governance structure, I used to think that. I just see it as silly now. I think it's just academic. It's what people think could work, but I mean, it doesn't happen in reality. Human nature needs hierarchy.
Well, I think that goes back to the "we are where we are" bit, and so it's largely a hypothetical. But I think I would say there's a pretty strong case for it in conditions where there's, if we talk about what the Will Keats proposition that you're at liberty to do whatever it is you would like to do until that encroaches on somebody else's ability to do the same. And if people are in such a situation where there is an availability of land, resources, etc., and therefore there is no need for people to necessarily come into conflict with one another, I can see exactly how that would work. And that, I mean, I don't mean to just turn this into a kind of cyclical conversation, but I do think that there is absolutely a way in which that can work without there needing to be any sort of formal hierarchy. Because look what you've just described. You've just described a family unit working, having a natural hierarchy. Well, no, as you say, you don't draw some document up and pin it on the house notice board. You just do it. And I that's sort of the way I look at it. So I think the terminology is confusing. I think people have this idea that anarchy and chaos are the same thing. That's not how I see it at all. No, exactly. They're not the same. So the trouble is, largely in this day and age, it is of course hypothetical. There are I mean, I can't speak of one off the top of my head, but there are definitely some societies in various parts of the world that do exist more or less on that basis, without there being a rigid structure and any idea of a sort of defined leader that must be followed. But yeah, they are few and far between, and that's because of all the factors that I think we've talked about.
I think to a certain degree, what we have been discussing is slightly academic. I think that for whatever, my question at the end of the day would be, the reality of our lives at the moment is, 70 million people in the United Kingdom, and whatever the populations of other major states are at the moment. That's how we're organized at the moment. What comes next? in the event that this democracy experiment has failed, which undoubtedly it has, how are we going to self-organize to keep ourselves in one piece? Because when societies collapse, that can be quite a violent act. Now, maybe that's part of the natural order. Maybe that's something that is required. I don't know, but I'm sure it's something that most people would prefer to avoid. And I am most concerned at the moment that people are so demoralized and disengaged that actually they're just going to sit and wait to see what's coming. And I think that's the best policy.
I think these kinds of conversations are completely fascinating because I think they provoke all sorts of ideas and thoughts that we really should have, but largely don't. Sometimes they can be a little bit sensitive. Sometimes, of course, exactly like we say, they're very nebulous because we don't really know. We don't know what happened in the past, and we certainly don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. I think in looking at the United Kingdom in particular, in what would be described as Western civilizations, Western democracies, I think, yes, for sure, there probably will be violent conflict in some places as these systems collapse. But I think actually probably to a far lesser extent than we imagine. And I think that is it. This is exactly what I'm talking about insofar as a system sort of implodes rather than explodes, because I think that populations now, the UK in particular, has become so weakened. This is sort of how we finished last week, but the actual condition of the humans that are operating within this system is so far below what it was that I don't think that sort of level of activity is really even possible. So either mentally or physically. So I don't think there'll be sort of catastrophic and cataclysmic results, but I do think that things will break to such a point where a new system must emerge, and what form that takes, I don't know. But it should. But I don't think that should be regarded as a negative. It should absolutely be a positive, because it does return to the idea of there being a natural order and there being a proper understanding of people having liberty, which by and large people just have no idea about.
I'd very much like to see South Africa break apart into various kingdoms. I think we'll have a more successful future than we do right now.
Yeah.
But that's my personal view.
Yeah.
Okay, Charles, Mike, thanks for the discussion, for the banter. I'll catch up with you guys next week.